Yes.
Morning, sir. David Rudd from Department of National Defense. I'm familiar somewhat after working for 5 years at our former Operational Support Command of some of the challenges that you highlighted there. One of them being the downturn in the number of U.S. flag merchant ships and merchant mariners, etc. You didn't mention the CRAF.
Right.
Does it still exist?
CRAF still exists.
Civil Reserve Air
so it's
Fleet.
a Civil Reserve Air Fleet. So it's subsidization of our commercial carriers, Delta, United, etc. So CRAF still exists. The Voluntary Intermodal Sea Lift Agreement, which is the same type of subsidy, for lack of a better term, to keep commercial surface vessels engaged, is also in place. The problem is that we're reaching an imbalance. As you know, in our Air Force, we've had a reduction in pilots. We've lost a lot of pilots. And so we're trying to make up for maintenance shortfalls, training shortfalls, and a lack of pilots. And because of the way we crew, we use reserve crews, right, and that we've been tapped for a while. And then you're having to double count those, because to keep the Civil Reserve Airlift fleet going, you're going to have to leverage those same pilots. So now that creates a further gap. Does that answer your question? To follow up? Yep.
Then surely one must pay also attention to the trends in the commercial airline industry, not simply the recruiting of pilots from the ISAF, but also the merger of airlines.
Right.
Because if you have a contract with Delta or something like that, how does if Continental United, which are now the same company, if either one of them had a contract and suddenly they merge, what happens to that? What happens to your contract? What happens to the capability?
Right. So you further diminish the capability, right? And so those are some of the things that I think, that I know General McDew is looking at from a Transcom perspective, is what's the viability over the long term, and where do we have the greatest gaps? How do we make those up? And I think when you talk about the viability of the industry and where it can operate, the wages that garners, and how dependent it is upon in competing, because there's also a readiness equation there, right? If you're constantly using the commercial contracted capability, you're not exercising your organic capability, and you have to find that balance. Because really, in the Pacific, we did something called Pacific Pathways to kind of keep that deterrence out there as we have stuff constantly in motion. Industry was quick to come in and say, hey, how come you're activating a RORO or an organic capability? Jones Act says, you got to go commercial first. Well, yeah, that's good, but we have to build that readiness from the theater all the way back to the sustaining base. We have to be able to activate those ships quickly. We have to bring the crews to bear, and then we have to get them out there, and they have to operate in concert with industry. And so using that as a model, we could at least do the first pathways of every three as kind of a balanced approach. But it is something we're looking at, and then what routes and what markets, because they're shrinking and they're not in all the places where we need to be. Just a thought.
So Stephanie Valaki, Queens, and thank you for your remarks this morning. My question is about the link you made between the military, academia, industry, and the need to bring in more people in order to arrive at more innovative solutions. And I think this is relevant for this context at the Kingston conference. And you see from the room there a mix of people coming from different sectors. So my question is for us academics, and how we can engage in a more sustained manner with military practitioners, and how we can maybe feed some of our research findings into some of the conversations or challenges you may be facing. With a colleague of mine, Professor Sustainment, who's sitting at the other table, and many other people in this room, we're starting a network called the Canadian Defence and Security Network to promote engagement of this kind more regularly. So we have a template and we're aspiring to do this, but I was wondering if you had advice for people in the room as academics on how to do this better.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Stephanie. I think, I was surprised this morning. I gave some remarks about 8 months ago, and a gentleman in the room came up to me this morning and said, hey, I still remember, what was it I said? Who. And my pitch to industry, that's who I was talking to, is help us, help you, help us. It's important, and that's essentially what you're asking. So when I was in the Pacific as a division level commander, I had logistics and engineering and sustainment from essentially from the west coast of the United States. So from Hollywood to Bollywood and from polar bears to penguins. That is what encompassed my realm. And so we said, hey, we can't be everywhere we need to be. We don't have sufficient visibility, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Industry plays a key role with helping us respond, and we're all going to operate in concert with one another. And that the fact that that's also the ring of fire, and there's a predominant humanitarian assistance and disaster relief need out there, our commercial partners are often the first in those areas. But where do our responsibilities merge, and where do they dissect? And so we began to do a series of quarterly engagements at the 8th Theater Sustainment Command and at US PACOM J4, where we would bring industry partners in a non-competitive environment, and we would say, okay, here's the problem set. But before we get started on the problem set today in a tabletop exercise, we would bring in folks like Dr. Sally Ride from the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And she would talk about the dynamic relationship between Russia and China relative to deploying the force, dealing with the economic or the air identification zone, the South China Sea, and things that bear on the problem, to where our industry partners would go, yeah, I probably learned that in high school or college, but I didn't really understand how it impacts my business model or our operations or other things. And so we began to, once we got past the lawyers and the acquisition professionals who said, oh, you can't bring all these people together, we found that we could. We structured it in a way where we did problem sets and said, okay, industry, how would you handle this? How do we share information? What technologies are we not aware of that will enhance our ability that we can leverage now? And when we went into Nepal for the earthquake, we were listening to the ODACA call, which is a joint interagency, intergovernmental call that from around the world that talks about what kind of resources are being placed together. And DHL called the headquarters and my operations center, and they called me up and said, hey, from the phone call, we understand that you're going to send in this capability that we exercised during your last tabletop. We know that that capability for this scenario, because we already have people on the ground there, is insufficient. You need to add these capabilities. Can you retask organize? We made that retask organization and got it in there, and we were much more capable and effective when we got on the ground. And that is an example of how I think you could work that and lay it out. And then what you ought to do is when you have large interagency or even combatant command level type activities, bring that in and show what you've done. We did that for Admiral Harris, and he found it quite enlightening. Just an example.
Hi, I'm Christine Fair from Georgetown, and thanks to logistical failures and our private sector partners, I just arrived last night. Shout out to United and American. So I really appreciate that you work on logistics, and I'm a South Asianist. My particular area of focus is the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater, and then as I walked in, I heard you talking about not retrenching from CENTCOM theaters, and I presume that that was an oblique reference to Afghanistan. And for several years, i.e. since 2001, when we invaded Afghanistan, I've been very concerned about a logistical problem, which is that we have been singularly reliant upon Pakistani ALOCs and GLOCs when they're the very country that undermines what we're trying to do in Afghanistan with our partners. I know, it's shocking. And you at CENTCOM, this is news to you, I know. But of course, those of us who are South Asianists, we've also been watching with considerable interest the Indian investments in Chabahar. And our previous president, with an S and not a C, was creating a space for our Indian partners to move things, for example, Afghan ANSF uniforms, for example, through Chabahar and into Afghanistan, creating an alternative to this pernicious dependence upon this one country that takes money from us while undermining us. And we are now in a position, of course, where Mr. Trump seems to think that Iran is more dangerous than Pakistan. And from a simple perspective of logistics and also this thing called a map, I find it very difficult to see how Mr. Trump can do what he says he's going to do in Pakistan while simply looking at a map and our logistical options. So I'm wondering if I could pull you out of the 33,000 meter space and bring you down to a little bit like the 1,000 foot space in that region. Thank you.
All right. So, yes, with about 5 tours in Afghanistan and having to work the POC, GLOC, and ALOC, first I'd say they're never going to shut off. This is Dorman's opinion. This is not General Votel's. Let me throw this out there. They're never going to shut off the ALOC. They might reduce the airspace to some degree based on altitude or something. But that would be an act of war. They don't really have the wherewithal to make that threat credible. They're not going to shoot anything out of the sky. They're not.
But they don't have to. You realize that, right? So we're giving them money, which they then...
Yeah, so I think I heard POTUS say we're not giving them anything, but...
But he hasn't changed anything, by the way. You know that, right?
What's that?
All he has done is spoken.
Yeah.
Our actual policy...
Well, yeah, you need a policy. You can announce a lot of things, but you got to have a real policy and strategy. I got it. So, but going back several years, they want money for all kinds of things, which we've refused to give them. The PAC GLOC works intermittently, but it's not our only game. We do have a northern distribution network. It had 5 routes. It now has 2 routes. It does.
You know, I know that region really well.
I know. And yeah, well, I just sent 160, and I'm going to send another 175 up-armored Humvees across the northern route, across Georgia into Poti, over to Kazakhstan, down through Uzbekistan, and that's working well. That's working fine. Now, that's a northern distribution network, not a northern access corridor, and there's a big difference there, right? We can't bring bombers, ISR, Mission Command, fighters, etc. through that route, so that is problematic. But you're going back to your point about uniforms and India's contribution. I think it goes back to my point where I said we have to be more willing to accept some risk. And we also have in authorities, right, and information sharing. So there are other, Mick Nicholson and I were talking about that. When he was the 3 and I was the 4 there under Petraeus, we said, hey, let's just shut down the PAC GLOC ourselves. Now, it ended up happening a little bit later, but we had prepared to shut it down ourselves. And we said, hey, we could use Charbahar. And everybody got all upset because it goes up through Iran. And I said, hey, look, we have partners and allies whose authorities make that non-problem. Now, what we have to quit doing is saying, yeah, but it's our gear until it's turned over to the Afghans, right? That also has to be changed. So you have to reframe the way you look at the problem set, and I think leverage those opportunities and authorities that you maybe don't have, or if you can't get them, leverage partners and allies. That's what an enterprise and a coalition does for you. So how's that?